So Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal needs no introduction. He is the member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So thank you so much, Mr. Sanyal, for taking out time. Let me begin, Mr. Sanyal, by what is the larger conversation which I'm seeing on social media across every political and economic domain. It's to do with China. Now, Mr. Sanyal, I very well remember that during the time of COVID, there were two models which were generally the talk of the town globally. One was what China was following, which was a zero COVID policy. And one was the democratic model of participatory governance involving the people of India, which involved partial lockdowns, which involved gradual easing, which was followed by the Prime Minister, the country, and that is how the economic policy was also taken forward. Now, how do you look at the current situation which is prevailing in China, Mr. Sanyal, because the World Bank has also downgraded the economic growth rate of China. You are seeing a new virus which is spreading at a disproportionate rate in China, and how will it impact the global economy, and particularly, is India prepared to handle another supply chain shock in the global economy if it comes because of the disruptions in China?
So first of all, let me say that it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for this opportunity to speak to all of you. You're absolutely right that there are some re-emerging concerns about COVID thanks to what is happening now in China. There are, of course, partial information of what is going on, but I think all indications are that it is quite a serious disruption to many things inside the country. As you also mentioned, that the exact approach that China and India used are in some ways symptomatic of the two very different approaches we have towards problem solving. China has historically solved problems by what I would call is the grand plan approach. There's a top-down grand plan and that approach, incidentally, we used to also do essentially till the 90s. We also had that grand planning approach. China did a good job of it. We didn't, so eventually we abandoned it. At least since the 90s, they seem to have, but this particular episode shows you what the flaw is in the grand plan approach. The top-down grand plan approach is that there's a group of people, in the Indian case it used to be the Planning Commission, know what is good, they have a grand plan, and they're going to implement it thoroughly. This is not a feedback loop-based approach. Our approach, and we explicitly used it during the COVID period, we are telling, is that, look, we are dealing with an evolving, uncertain situation. The strategy is not to have a grand plan and no. Now, that is sometimes very disconcerting to people. Oh, my God, they don't have a grand plan. We don't. It's an evolving situation. We told you right there. What you do is you hedge for the worst case outcomes. For example, using a temporary lockdown, for example. But then basically what you do, you use a feedback loop and adjust to things as they evolve. Something I've said in even the height of COVID, we were trying to explain this. Now, in the short run, it looks much more chaotic because you are repeatedly changing direction. But as I hope people now appreciate, in the longer run, your ability to deal with evolving situations more flexibly will win out over the grand plan. But in the end, unless you just happen to be very, very lucky, that grand plan effectively will not be able to deal with all kinds of evolving things that may turn out to be. And I think China's zero COVID policy is a good example of what happens when the grand plan comes unstuck. Our approach of feedback loops and flexibility, on the other hand, looks somewhat disorganized in the beginning, but as it sort of gathers pace, we have shown you that in the longer run is just vastly superior. Now, this doesn't mean that it's all over. The fact of the matter is, there is something happening now in China. Yet again, we have incomplete or very little information coming out of what exactly is happening, either from the Chinese authorities or from WHO. The best information we do have is that this is an existing variant, but of course that may not be true. So we need to be very careful In case that turns out to be a new variant, then obviously we will have to see what happens. But our best guess at this point is that it is an existing variant, in which case our existing vaccines and our existing natural immunity is perhaps good enough. We don't know. But there is no question that we need to be very, very careful, keep our eyes open. Obviously, there are issues now that we will face as far as direct contact is concerned, particularly with international travel. We don't have too much direct flights, but people will come through third-party, third-country sources. So we do need to have a heightened level of awareness in our airports. So as things are, yet again, we will deal with this flexibly, deal with it through a feedback loop and keeping our eyes open. And let me assure you that the Indian government is fully cognizant of what could be a risk, and we will respond as necessary. And you have already heard that we are already, taking meetings and regularly monitoring the situation.
Mr. Sanyal, I've been, closely following you. You've always been very optimistic on the Indian economy. At the same time, you've also been very pragmatic. Now, in one of your interviews, you've said that this time India is very well prepared on the supply side to even grow at more than 9%. But at this moment, 6 and 6.5% growth rate is also, considering the global scenario, significantly strong growth rate. Now, my question to you is that, again, coming on the China question, with the vulnerabilities attached to China, do we expect that the 9% target, which is definitely possible in the near future, is that over-optimistic? And also, when you talk about India is prepared from the supply side, in fact, you've said that you need an open road to grow at more than 9%. What are the bottlenecks to that open road? And how has the supply side preparedness changed now vis-a-vis, say, a few years back in the earlier regime?
So, yet again, let me delineate how our entire economic management is fundamentally different from what rest of the world did, and more importantly, many US-based economists wanted us to do. It may have been clear throughout this that we are effectively supply-side economists, and we are macroeconomic conservatives. So throughout that entire episode of the COVID shock, what did we continue doing? Worst of all, we never lost control of macroeconomic stability. So even when there was a lot of pressure to go out there, splurge on the monetary and fiscal side, we retained certain amount of restraint. Instead, what we did is that we kept investing on our supply side. Now, this is not something we suddenly began doing. Even before the COVID crisis, we were doing painful reforms which needed to be done. So, introduction of GST, for example, it's a framework reform that had to be done at some point. We did it. Insolvency and bankruptcy code and the consequent cleaning up of the banking system, the imposition of a inflation targeting framework, and so on and so forth. So we were building the framework for a supply side improvement in the economy. We kept that up even in the middle of all the COVID confusion, crisis, etc. You look at the large numbers of sectors that we liberalized during COVID: space, drones, geospatial sector, and so on and so forth. We privatized Air India. So our consistent effort to keep improving the flexibility of the economy has been a consistent feature. Now, why were we doing this? We were doing this because our view has always been that the post-COVID world is not merely a reinvention or re-inflation of the pre-COVID world. That is the view of the demand walas. We supply walas always think that, look, the future is going to have a different universe. It's not a tire that has just got air pushed out and you need to bump it up. No, it's a different tire. Now, this world will have its own geopolitics, its own technologies, its own supply chains, its own consumer behavior. I have no way of predicting this. So what you do is you invest into creating flexibility in the economy. And the result of that is that the cumulative effect of all these reforms is that our economy is now radically more efficient, productive and competitive than it has ever been. Our banking system is cleaned up. Remember how it was 4 or 5 years ago? If we had gone to the crisis with that banking system, we would have had a financial crisis. We didn't. Our banks are actually better off today than they were actually, ironically, before the crisis, despite all the problems.
Absolutely.
Then the infrastructure. We have kept investing in infrastructure. I apologize to some of you who live in cities like Mumbai, which are half dug up. But believe me, many of those great projects are coming on stream in the next 24 months. Delhi will have a swanking new airport just east to us in, I think, 36, 40 months' time. It'll be a really cool airport, believe me. And so on and so forth. We have kept up that effort, and the result is that our supply side of the economy is now, and as you just mentioned, I think capable of doing 9% on a sustained basis. Now, does that mean that we will be hitting that 9%? No. We have upgraded from an ambassador to a better car, whatever your favorite car is. But that doesn't mean you want to press the accelerator, because the road is still bumpy. And that bumpiness is almost entirely happening about the environment, the global environment in which we are, which is disrupted. There is obviously a war situation in Eastern Europe. Oil prices have just now come down, but they were very elevated till just a few weeks ago. There are serious problems with China. Particularly, we don't know exactly how supply chains of critical inputs into all kinds of things like pharmaceuticals, etc. will be. So there are all kinds of problems, no doubt about it. So should we be pressing the accelerator now to grow it at 9%? Answer is no. Because if we attempted to do it, what would happen is that the growth in our imports would simply outstrip the ability of our exports to keep up. I mean, our services exports are doing exceptionally well, but the goods exports will be under some stress because the markets are not growing, even if we are getting better market share. So, in order not to overheat the system, it is not a good idea, in my view, to push the accelerator now. Given the circumstances, the growth rates we are hitting of 6.5% to 7% this year and next year, they are by some long margin faster than any other growth rate of any major economy in the world. I think we should be satisfied with that. This is about compounding growth, not about managing to spike growth in any one year. Keep this going, and a time will come where we will get an open road, like we did, for example, between 2002 and 2007. We got a 5-year window, we massively increased our growth rates. Of course, the system then overheated, etc. That's different. I think now our systems are much better. We'll be able to sustain these growth rates for whatever that length of open road we get.
Mr. Sanyal, one constant, I would say, a critique, now whether that's a genuine critique or not, but a critique has been that when you grow at more than 6.5%, or even say long-term 9%, will it be or is it inclusive in nature? Now, your former counterpart, Mr. Rajan, has been using this word called inclusive growth. Now, when I look at 6.5% right now, for a layman on the ground, the question is this inclusive in nature? And how do you look at the critique of growth not being inclusive that comes across every now and then?
So, first of all, be very clear that growth is a necessary condition. It may not be sufficient, but it's a necessary condition for removing poverty. Otherwise, what we will get is just a redistribution of poverty. And unfortunately, we spend so much of our energy since 1947 till recent, maybe the last decade, in spending our time, somehow trying to see ways in which we can redistribute poverty. It's largely a waste of time. We need to have growth in order to have the wealth to distribute. So, first of all, never lose sight of the fact that you see, at $2,400 per capita, where we are at today, after all this growth, this is where we have reached. This is still just too poor to redistribute.
Absolutely.
So, we have to grow. Now, that growth will, of course, some amount of trickle down will happen, naturally, because it will create jobs and so on. That does not mean this trickle down does not need to be aided. And so here comes the sufficient condition part. Here, there are two parts to it. One is that you need to create certain kinds of safety nets for shocks. And you will see that during the COVID crisis, we did that. For example, making food available for 800 million people for free. Not every one of them turned up to ask for rations, but it was available. So one is the safety net aspect, but there are a large number of directed, targeted interventions that we have done, whether it is cooking gas, or it is now water or toilets and so on. These are directed, or Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. All these are directed, targeted interventions to simply shift people out into a slightly different orbit so that they can begin to get into the virtuous cycle where they benefit from the growth. So we are fully cognizant of the fact that a helping hand is needed. So yes, you do need to talk about growth, and you do need to talk about creating those channels for letting a larger section of society be included in that growth. Absolutely correct. But I think the problem with many of those who claim to be talking about inclusive growth, and so on, is that they throw the baby out with the bathwater, that then it becomes somehow that growth itself is not to be aspired for. I'm sorry. You need the growth, first of all, in order to be able to do the rest of the things. This is what generates the revenues, so for us to spend on various social schemes. This is what creates the jobs, and even in the first instance, that allows much of this to poverty reduction to happen. So let me end by saying, inclusive growth is absolutely critical, but do remember that the growth is the driving force here. And yes, we have to intervene to make sure it is more inclusive. And I don't think anybody will fault this government for having gone out there and done these vast number of schemes. I mentioned a whole bunch of them, from cooking gas to toilets to Awas Yojana to whatever else you want to focus on. There is absolutely a great amount of emphasis in doing these redistribution schemes, and they have been very, very successful.
Mr. Sanyal, when you look at these growth projections, long-term growth projections, another worrying aspect is inflation. Now, why do I say so is because you rightly mentioned that there are a lot of geopolitical global vulnerabilities which are attached. We do not know how the world will be in the next 1 year. So for a common man, is the government at this moment very cognizant of keeping the inflation in the bracket where it does not go beyond proportion? And how is the government looking at the inflation target vis-a-vis growth, particularly as you start growing at a larger, say 6.5%? How are you looking at keeping inflation within the bracket where it does not go beyond a particular limit?
So, as I said right in the beginning, we are macroeconomic conservatives. It is this government that introduced the inflation targeting framework. Do remember that before we put this in, India is not a high inflation country in the sense, say, Argentina is a high inflation country or Turkey is a high inflation country, but we were a high-ish inflation country where inflation systematically used to be in the 8 to 12% range. Since the introduction of the inflation targeting framework, this has been pulled down for the most part in the 4 to 6% range, which is the target. And by the way, doing this, we also took the pain of a somewhat slower growth rates in 17, 18, 19 period, because obviously these are contractionary policies. And remember, we were also cleaning up the banks and so on, but they were necessary. But now, having lowered the expectations and the momentum of inflation, we have proven that we can keep it anchored. Sure, it did spike up briefly past the upper limit of 6%, but the fact is it was still well below what the rest of the world was facing in a situation where basically even Western countries, which usually have inflation which are sub 5%, all saw it go into double digits. We retained somewhere in the 7.5% range at its peak, and it's now drifting down again. So I think the fact that under these circumstances, we were able to maintain inflation control, I think is creditable. I have to give full credit to the Monetary Policy Committee and Reserve Bank Governor Das for the effort that their team put in to do that, and of course to the fiscal team as well in terms of fiscal management. And I think looking ahead, inflationary pressures are globally now coming off. That doesn't mean that you'll see monetary conditions being reversed just yet, but it does mean, I think, the pace of tightening will taper off. And this is good because, even with all this tightening, the momentum in our economy is in good shape. Our macroeconomic indicators are in good shape. So as this tapers off, I think we will find ourselves at a good place.
Mr. Sanyal, towards the last part of my interview, I also want your comments on the historic opportunity which is there in front of India, that is the presidency of G20. Now, Mr. Kant is also here, which is there. But I want to look from your point of view, because this, as I was looking at your and Mr. Kant's conversation in one of the interviews, you also looked at the economic opportunity which India has, because the G20 is just not now limited to the programs, it's just not limited to Delhi, Mumbai, you are expanding across different cities. How do you look at it economically as an economic opportunity, and how is India looking at the G20 presidentship from the economic point of view, not from the Sherpa point of view?
So let me say very clearly that historically, India has not punched its weight. And now our weight is much bigger. We are the world's 5th largest economy. We will soon be the world's 3rd largest economy. We will soon be also the world's most populous country. So we need to get comfortable in our skins in terms of punching our own weight. And as demonstrated with the whole debate around Russian oil, for example, when we clearly articulate our interests, the rest of the world mostly, if it's a reasonable request, they accommodate it. So I think we need to get comfortable in that. And I think in that journey, the G20 presidency is an important step for a number of reasons. Not only that this will be hopefully the first full year post-COVID that things will be kept open, fingers crossed. We will hopefully, there are a large number of major issues on which India can provide leadership, not the least in the geo-strategic area and conflicts around the world. But also, very importantly, I think a change in the way we are doing this. In most countries, but also in India, this whole business of participating in the world economy, in the world conversations, tended to be a Mumbai-Delhi thing. So the Mumbai did the world financial type of thing, and Delhi did whatever, geostrategic, political discussions. What we have done through this G20 and spreading it through, I think, 50 locations across the country, have got the whole country in the conversation. This is important because, in a sense, we have then spread the story. Whole country feels it's not some tiny elite based in Mumbai or Delhi who matters in this conversation. We are getting them to go to Imphal. We are getting them to go to Port Blair. And it really has got the whole country sort of buzzed up about this. There's a fantastic event that Mr. Khan just organized in Udaipur where he was very kind to invite me. It really is about getting the country involved and at the same time showcasing India to the rest of the world as well. That here is in India that can play at various levels. We can showcase the wonderful archaeological sites, etc., in places like Kumbhalgarh or Varanasi and so on. At the same time, we have high-tech centers in Hyderabad and Bangalore and Chennai or in Noida and so on. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us to showcase India as an emerging power, and I'm glad we are using it.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Member Economic Advisory Council, Prime Minister's Office. Thank you so much, Mr. Sanyal, for taking out time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.